So to be able to manage the score of the game, what we're going to do is create a new object and a new script that will run how the game is running. So we're going to call this new script, we're going to go down here, create C# script, and we're going to call it the game manager. Now before we go ahead and start writing bits into the script, let's actually create it as an object within the world. So I'm going to switch back over to scene view. Just wait till the new script is compiled. There we go. I'm going to create a new empty object that I'm going to call the game manager. It doesn't really matter where it is in the world, it's fine to be there. And we're going to add that new script we just created into there so that we don't forget to do it later on, because there's many times where you're editing a script and then you actually forget to apply it back into the game. So let's open this up in MonoDevelop. We'll give it a second here. Okay, so we've got our game manager. So if we're going to make changes to this object within the world, which is our canvas kind of text object, we know that we want to change that to reflect whatever the current score is. So we'll need a reference to that object within the world. But the problem is the UI elements of Unity work slightly different than normal coding does. So we need to actually specifically state that within Unity we're using the UI interface. So what we do is up here where we have other basic elements that we're using by default within Unity, just below that we're going to say using Unity engine .ui. And what that means is basically the UI sections of code within Unity, we now have access to them by including that up here. So now we can say we're going to create a public text object that we're going to call score text, like that, with a semicolon at the end. And a text object is basically back here in Unity this text object that we created to represent the score. So I just save that and we're compiling it back into Unity here. And if I go to the game manager, now I can click and drag this text object into place just there like that. And now we're specifically talking about this text object right here. So now that we know where we're going to be sending the score to, we need to have a way of keeping track of the score. So we're going to create a private int that we're going to call score1, and that'll be the score for player 1. The reason we make it private is because we want to be controlling this score from within the game manager script only, not from anywhere else. And we make it an int because the score is only going to be a whole number value. We're never going to have a score of 0.5, a score of 3.7. That's not going to happen. We're just going to have scores of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. So we have the score for player 1. Let's make a score for player 2 also. And for the moment, that's all we need. So by default, obviously, when our game starts, scores for both the players will be 0. So how do we add a score when our ball enters the goal zone, for example? What we'll do is create a new custom function down here in our game manager. So after the update loop, we're going to create a new function down here. So we're going to say it's a public function. We're going to say void because it's not returning any other specific values, but this is basically something you need to add in when you're creating a function like this. So we'll just say public void, and the name of the function that we're going to create is update score. And when you're creating a function, what you then need to do is add 2 little normal brackets like this, and then our couple of little squiggly lines, just like every other kind of default function built into Unity. Now what we want to add into our update score here is an int value that will mean the player. So basically what we'll say is we're adding an int here to check if it's player 1 that's getting its score updated or player 2 that's getting its score updated. So we're going to say here if player equals 1. So what we're saying is if the int value that we're given in the update score is 1, then we know we're adding something to player 1. So we're saying, okay, if it's player 1, then we're saying score 1 equals score 1 plus 1. So what we're saying is, so by default, obviously at the start, our score will be 0. If this function is called, then if it's called with player 1 being entered into the brackets, then it'll say, okay, if the player is 1, then we're adding score 1 to be now 1. And so on. As we add more score, it'll add 1 on every single time. The other option is if player equals 2, then we say score 2 equals score 2 plus 1. So the way we're writing here with score 2 is equal to score 2 plus 1, it's kind of the long way to do it. There's actually a very simple way to quickly be able to update values within Unity. Instead of saying score 2 equals score 2 plus 1, what we can actually do is just do score 2 plus equals 1. And what that means is it'll take whatever the current value is that's in score 2 and it'll just add 1 onto it. So say our score is currently 4, it'll just add 1, it'll become 5. It's a much more simple way and a way of cutting down the amount of time you have to write code. So I'm going to do the exact same thing for score 1 up here, like that. I just realized that for some reason these are, 1 is capitalized and 1 isn't. Actually, it should be not capitalized, like that. And then finally, when we have the score of either player, if it's been updated, then we want to update the score that's being displayed on screen. And that's our score that's on the score text object up here. So on our score text object, so what that refers to, if we go back here, is the text object here, and it's specifically the text component of this object. So within that, we want to make adjustments to what's written, which is within the text box here. So what we're talking about is the text box on the text component. So then what we need to do is go into the score text, which is the component, and access the text box, which is .text. And we want to set that to be equal to, what we want it to display is the score for player 1, then a space and a dash and a space, and then the score for player 2. So what we write is score 1, so that's a score for player 1, plus, then inside of these quotation marks we write the space, then the dash, and then the space. Then we say plus again, and then score 2, like that. And that's very simple and very straightforward. That's how we'll update the score on the screen. So we've created this function that is called to say if player 1 gets a point or if player 2 gets a point. But at the moment, it won't actually do anything because it has to know when to call this function. And when to call the function is, if we go back to our ball controller script, whenever our ball enters the goal zone, we want to call that function on the game manager. So if we want to call the function from the game manager, we need a reference to the game manager back up here. So we're going to create public game manager that we'll just call the GM, nice and simple, nice and short. And then down here, when our ball enters the goal zone, so if our ball enters the goal zone on the left, that means the player on the right should get a point, which is player 2. So what we'll do is, on our game manager, we're going to call the function that we created, which was update score. And because we know we want to give score to player 2, we'll add the number 2. So then what will happen is it'll call this function and it'll run over to the game manager and it'll run here and it'll say, okay, the int player value that we put in was 2. So it'll check if player is equal to 2, as it is, then it'll add 1 onto the player and then it'll update the score on the screen. So let's go back to our ball controller and we'll do the exact same thing for the other goal. We'll put gm.update score, and instead of giving a score to player 2, we're going to give the score to player 1. We'll save this, we'll go back into the game. We'll let this compile here for a second. And then we need to make sure on our ball to assign the game manager to the slot that we just created in the game manager function. Or in the ball controller, script. So on our ball over here, we have now the slot for the GM. So we're going to grab the game manager, pop it in there like that. And on our game manager, all we have is the slot for the text object. So now if we hit play, what we should get when the ball enters either zone is now we have score being added. So we can see our score is being added for player 1 there. Let's give some points to player 2. And there we go. We now have our score being added to the game just the way we want it to. So we can now play to our heart's content. We've got the basic elements of the game, so let's keep refining it more and make it more of an actual fully featured game. So at the moment, one of the major problems that we have is that our paddles can move off the screen like this. And so therefore, as you can see, it's just happened there. When the ball entered the zone on the right there, it should have got reset to be in front of the paddle, but because it was up here, off to the side, it got bounced off. It would have bounced off down here, I think. Or no, it goes up on the y-axis, isn't it? Sorry. So it would have gone off, flying off into space. So somewhere, our ball is now flying away like mad, which is no good to anybody. So what we need to do is make sure that our paddles can only stay within the screen. So that's what we're going to take a look at doing next.